She came to the park just to relax, but two police officers decided to exceed their authority. Their arrogance quickly crossed all boundaries, but within a minute, they were screaming in pain. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in soft shades of orange and rose, the light filtering through the branches of tall elms that lined the winding paths of the city park. The air carried a blend of scents, freshly cut grass from an earlier maintenance crew, faint blossoms still holding onto the season, and the earthy aroma of damp soil that had been warmed all day by the sun. It was the kind of evening when even the busiest of people felt compelled to slow their pace, to breathe more deeply, to notice the simple beauty around them. For Rhonda, it was a rare opportunity to enjoy solitude without the eyes of cameras, the noise of arenas, or the pressing demands of training and publicity. She had begun her run a little before the sunset, when the air was still heavy with warmth but not oppressive, and her body welcomed the rhythm of steady strides. The path curved past benches where elderly couples rested, past playgrounds where children's laughter rang like bells, and past the lake where ducks glided lazily on the shimmering water. Her breath came in disciplined patterns, her heart steady, her muscles singing with the pleasant ache of exertion. Unlike her competitive bouts, where every movement was strategic and charged with adrenaline, this run was a kind of meditation. Each step was both deliberate and free, tethering her to the moment, yet liberating her from thought. The park had always been a sanctuary for her when she traveled, no matter what city or country she found herself in. There was something universal about it: the benches, the lamps that would soon flicker on, the jogging paths traced by thousands of feet before hers. Sitting at home or in a hotel room could never replicate the peace she found in simply moving forward under the open sky. She ran not to escape her life as an athlete, but to remind herself of the quieter strength that existed beyond the ring. Eventually, the burn in her calves and the light dampness of sweat on her skin told her she had done enough for the day. She slowed, walked a short distance, then finally sat down on a wooden bench set just off the main path. She pulled a small bottle of water from her waist pouch, twisted off the cap, and drank deeply. The liquid was cool, refreshing, a welcome relief after the long run. She leaned back, let her head rest against the wooden slats, and closed her eyes for a moment. Around her, the sounds of the park unfolded like a symphony: the distant bark of a dog chasing a ball, the shuffle of feet as a couple strolled by, the soft trill of birds high in the trees preparing to roost. Her breathing slowed. The tempo of her heartbeat eased into a steady calm. In that moment, she was not Ronda Rousey, the fighter, the celebrity, the name plastered on posters. She was simply a woman sitting in a public park, allowing herself to exist quietly. There was a humility in this, a kind of groundedness that fame often tried to strip away. She thought briefly of her life, the constant need to prove herself, to remain unbreakable in the public eye. Even strength could feel heavy at times, and here she could set it down, if only for a few minutes. The park became her private arena of peace, where no one demanded her victory, where her only opponent was fatigue, and her only prize was tranquility. She tilted her head back and opened her eyes to watch the sky, streaked now with deeper hues as the sun dipped further toward the horizon. For a few long minutes, everything was still. People passed at a distance, but none intruded. The evening light draped itself across the path like a silken veil, and even the city beyond the park seemed hushed, its noise dampened by trees and distance. She imagined that this, more than the roar of a crowd or the weight of a medal, was what she craved most. Silence filled not with emptiness, but with life gently unfolding around her. The muscles in her arms and legs softened as she let them rest, yet beneath the stillness, the habits of a fighter remained. Her body held itself with a readiness that no amount of calm could erase, as though every sinew and reflex lived perpetually half a breath away from action. Years of discipline had etched this into her, not as tension, but as awareness. It was not paranoia, but vigilance, a constant hum in the background of her being. Her eyes drifted across the park, the outline of the lampposts that would soon light the paths, the faint glow of the city skyline peeking through the trees, the jogger making one last loop before dusk, the mother gathering her children to head home. Each detail folded into her awareness. Each detail reassured her that all was ordinary. And yet, in the quiet corners of her instinct, there was an unshakable knowledge that peace was never permanent. The world had a way of testing her, often when she least expected it. Rhonda exhaled slowly and stretched her arms across the backrest of the bench, her fingers tapping idly against the wood. The air cooled as the sun lowered, and with it came a shift in the mood of the park. Where moments ago it was filled with energy, it now began to thin. Families departed, joggers dispersed, and the crowd ebbed until only a scattering of solitary figures remained. The laughter of children was replaced by the rustle of leaves, and the once busy pathways became longer stretches of emptiness. She noticed it not with alarm but with acceptance. The day was ending, and the park was surrendering to night. In this fading light, the shadows stretched long, bending across the benches and paths. The breeze grew sharper, and the coolness made her shoulders instinctively draw inward beneath her thin running shirt. She knew it was almost time to leave, to return to the other parts of her life waiting beyond the gates of the park. And yet she lingered. Something in her resisted breaking this spell too soon. Perhaps it was because moments like this were so rare moments, where she wasn't preparing for a fight, giving an interview, or meeting obligations. Here, sitting alone as the last glow of day bled into evening, she could simply be. She sipped again from her bottle, eyes closing as if to capture the sensation and lock it inside her memory. The stillness might have lasted forever in her imagination, but real life was less forgiving. Somewhere on the path, footsteps echoed with a rhythm that did not belong to a jogger or a casual stroller. They were heavier, slower, more deliberate. The sound carried across the otherwise quiet park, interrupting the harmony she had cocooned herself in. Her eyes opened and her head turned slightly. The calm she had nurtured did not vanish, but it shifted into something else. Awareness sharpening, instincts stirring. Two figures approached in the dimming light. At first they were only silhouettes, but as they drew nearer, the details of their uniforms became visible. Police officers, moving with the kind of confidence that came not from urgency, but from ownership of the space. Their voices reached her faintly low, casual, accompanied by laughter that seemed out of place in the solemn quiet of dusk. Rhonda straightened on the bench, her body language still composed but more alert. She told herself they were perhaps on patrol, that they would pass by without incident. Yet a faint prickle along the back of her neck reminded her of what experience had taught her time and again. Peace could turn to conflict in an instant, and the world often tested those who least desired a fight. The sun slipped lower, leaving the park bathed in half-light. The approaching officers closed the distance with unhurried ease, their shadows long and crooked across the path. The serenity of the evening fractured ever so slightly, and though Rhonda's posture remained calm, the storm's first whisper had already brushed across her skin. The evening light had almost surrendered to dusk when the two officers finally emerged from the shadows of the path and drew nearer to the bench. Their approach was unhurried, as if the park itself belonged to them, their boots striking the gravel with a confidence that felt less like duty and more like possession. Rhonda kept her posture still, her shoulders square and calm, her eyes steady as she watched them come closer. At first she thought perhaps they were on routine patrol, ensuring the park was safe as the day faded into night. But something in their movements carried none of the professional sharpness she was accustomed to seeing in officers who truly cared about their task. These men seemed loose, almost casual, their laughter trailing ahead of them in the silence like a sour note in an otherwise delicate song. They stopped not far from her, lingering with a kind of deliberate slowness, glancing at each other before shifting their attention to her. The taller one, whose face was round and whose uniform buttons strained slightly against the weight of his body, offered a grin that did not reach his eyes. The other, leaner with sharp features that looked carved from stone, tilted his head as though assessing her not as a citizen but as some curiosity to toy with. There was no urgency in their manner, no sense of patrolling for safety. Instead, they seemed drawn to her presence with an intent that unsettled the quiet atmosphere. "Evening," the taller officer said, his tone heavy with something that was meant to sound friendly but landed closer to intrusive. "Long day for a run, isn't it?" His gaze lingered on her with too much weight, sliding over her posture, her clothes, the sheen of sweat still cooling on her skin. Rhonda gave a polite nod, her expression composed. "Just finishing up," she replied. Her voice was measured, offering nothing beyond what courtesy demanded. The second officer stepped a little closer, his boots crunching on the gravel as he circled partway around her bench. "You out here by yourself?" he asked, the words framed like a question of safety but dripping with suggestion. His eyes narrowed slightly, studying her the way predators studied prey, not rushing but savoring the moment. She straightened a fraction, her body still calm but her instincts noting every shift in their stance, every line of their shoulders. "Just enjoying the evening," she answered, careful to keep her tone neutral. She had no intention of provoking, but neither would she submit to whatever game they were playing. The taller one chuckled, a low sound that seemed to carry mockery more than amusement. "Nice evening, though it gets lonely. A woman like you ought to have some company." His grin widened, the words hanging in the air like smoke. The other officer joined him with a laugh of his own, shaking his head. "Or maybe she's waiting for us. Who knows?" He moved a step closer, his presence edging uncomfortably into her space. Rhonda said nothing at first, simply meeting his gaze with eyes that held no fear. Inside, she felt the quiet hum of her training rising, the awareness of tension before a strike, the calm that always came before chaos. She had been in arenas filled with roaring crowds, under lights that blinded and burned, with opponents across from her who wanted nothing less than her defeat. Compared to that, these men were nothing, and yet their uniforms lent them a different kind of power, one that twisted responsibility into arrogance. She knew that kind of power could be more dangerous than fists. "Do you come here often?" The leaner officer pressed, his voice lower now, carrying an edge that sought to draw her in. He was not asking out of curiosity. He was probing, looking for cracks, for an opening to establish dominance. Rhonda gave him no such satisfaction. "Sometimes," she said, her tone even, clipped and final. For a heartbeat, silence stretched between them. Then the taller officer barked a laugh, loud enough to draw the attention of a couple walking on the far path. They turned their heads briefly, slowed for a moment, then decided against interference and continued on their way. The officers seemed to relish this, as if the subtle acknowledgement from strangers had emboldened them further. "You know," the tall one said, leaning slightly forward, "it's not every day we run into someone like you. You should consider yourself lucky." His words carried a weight that was less about compliment and more about possession, as though her mere presence before them was a prize for them to claim. Rhonda forced a small, polite smile, though her eyes remained cold. "I'm sure you meet a lot of people in your line of work," she replied. The lean officer chuckled at that, stepping even closer until the distance between them was more intimate than professional. "Not like you," he said softly, his eyes tracing her face, his posture radiating a dangerous confidence. His hand hovered at his side, close enough to the bench to make his intent clear, without yet acting on it. The weight of the moment pressed on Rhonda like a shifting current. She adjusted her position slightly, shifting her legs, hoping the movement would signal enough discomfort to make them reconsider, but they did not move back. Instead, the lean officer's hand dropped casually to the bench, his fingers just inches from her leg, as if daring to close the gap. She inhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral, though the muscles in her arms coiled with readiness. "Excuse me," she said firmly, though not loud, her voice holding the authority of a warning. "You're too close." The taller officer tilted his head, feigning innocence. "We're just talking. No harm in a little company." His grin faltered into something colder when she did not soften in response. But the lean officer was less subtle. His fingers inched closer, brushing lightly against her knee. The contact was minimal, fleeting, but it was enough. Enough to declare his disregard for her boundaries, enough to poison the air with violation. Rhonda's body stiffened, her calm composure cracking with sharp lines of steel. "I said you're too close," she repeated, this time with a voice that cut sharper, colder, like ice breaking. The officer only smirked, his hand lingering as if daring her to react. "Relax," he murmured. "We're just trying to get to know you." Her patience thinned, her instincts screaming that this was no longer a matter of words. Yet she forced herself to hold still, to give them the chance to retreat. For years she had learned that power was not in the first strike, but in the control to withhold it. She was control embodied, every muscle leashed by will. Still, the taller one leaned closer, his shadow blotting out what little remained of the sunset glow. His smile faded into something darker. "You don't want to make this difficult, do you?" he asked, though the question was no question at all. It was a statement of arrogance, a declaration that he believed the uniform on his back made him untouchable. Rhonda did not answer. Her silence was deliberate, her gaze steady, unflinching. She had been in silence like this before, seconds before a referee's signal, moments before fists collided. It was the silence of anticipation, of calculation. The leaner officer's hand grew bolder, pressing slightly against her knee this time, testing how far he could go. The act was not dramatic, not violent, but its weight was crushing all the same. It was the kind of moment that stripped dignity in small, deliberate motions, the kind that expected compliance because of fear. Rhonda's heart beat steady, but the storm had already begun to gather inside her. The air in the park had shifted. What had begun as an evening of peace, of gentle calm and fleeting light, had thickened into something more suffocating. The two officers remained close, too close, their laughter a shade darker now, their words heavier, bolder, no longer disguising the malice behind their casual tone. Rhonda could feel it, the tilt of the world around her, the way their presence seemed to dim what was left of the day. The sun had dipped almost entirely below the horizon, leaving only a pale glow stretched thin across the treetops. And in that dimness, their shadows loomed larger, their intent more dangerous. They no longer pretended to be on patrol. They no longer masked their approach as duty or protection. Instead, they stood before her as men who had convinced themselves that their badges gave them authority not only over law, but over dignity, over the simple right of a person to sit on a bench in peace. Their words fell sharper now, each syllable tinged with ownership. "Don't be so uptight," the taller officer muttered, his grin stretched into a sneer. "We're just being friendly." Friendly was not the word for it. Friendly did not involve looming, did not involve trapping her on a bench with their bodies angled to block her way. Friendly did not involve the leaner officer's hand brushing her knee again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if daring her to react. She drew in a measured breath, her eyes narrowing, but her body still. Years of training had taught her that control was the foundation of strength. She could crush them in an instant if she wished, but discipline urged her to hold, to wait, to allow them every chance to retreat from the line they were inching closer to crossing. Her voice when she spoke carried that same measured control. "I said, you're too close." The words were colder now, firm, her eyes locking with his in warning. The lean officer's smirk widened, mocking. "What's the matter? You think you're too good for us? A girl like you should be flattered we're even talking to you." His voice had dropped lower, more intimate, his breath sour in the cooling air. Rhonda shifted her leg, a subtle movement to create distance. But he moved with her, his hand sliding forward again. The taller one laughed, a harsh sound that bounced unnaturally in the near-empty park. "Don't play hard to get," he said. "We always get what we want." That sentence cut sharper than the touch, a declaration not only of arrogance, but of the corruption that came with believing themselves untouchable. Rhonda felt a flicker of heat rise in her chest, her body's natural instinct to strike, to end this immediately. But still she restrained it. She wanted no doubt left later, no question of who had provoked whom. Her voice, low and dangerous, slipped between them like the edge of a blade. "Take your hands off me, now." For a moment, the lean officer paused, his smirk faltering. But the pause was not hesitation born of fear. It was calculation, a weighing of how far he was willing to push. He exchanged a glance with his partner, a silent communication passing between them. Then, as if emboldened by each other's presence, he pressed harder, his hand gripping her knee with force this time. Not a brush, but a claim. Rhonda's body stiffened, her every muscle coiled with electric readiness. This was no longer about words, no longer about discomfort or the threat of humiliation. This was violation, pure and undeniable. She knew in that instant that the storm she had held back could not be contained much longer. The taller officer leaned closer, his bulk casting her in shadow. "Come on, sweetheart," he said in a low growl. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Her eyes snapped up to his, her gaze burning with the cold fire of someone who had been underestimated too many times before. She did not raise her voice, did not flinch, but her words carried the weight of finality. "This is your last warning." "And mine." They laughed again, both of them, though their laughter rang more desperate than before, as though they were trying to convince themselves they still held the upper hand. The lean officer released her knee only to step around her, his body shifting so that he now stood to her side, effectively blocking her escape. The taller one stood in front, his hands settling on his belt, his stance wide, dominating. "You're not going anywhere until we're done here," the tall one said. Around them, the park had grown almost empty. The last families had departed. The joggers had vanished into the streets beyond the gates. A single passerby in the distance looked in their direction, slowed, then turned down another path, unwilling to involve himself. The world had narrowed to the bench, to the dim glow of the lamppost nearby, to the circling menace of two men who mistook cruelty for control. Rhonda felt the silence press against her like a second skin. The hum of insects, the faint rush of traffic beyond the trees, all faded beneath the drumbeat of her own pulse. She had given them every chance, offered them the warning they did not deserve, and still they chose arrogance. Still they chose to push further. The lean officer reached out again, this time for her arm. His fingers brushed her wrist before tightening, testing her, pulling slightly as though to drag her upward. His grin widened as though he had succeeded, as though possession was already his. That was the moment the patient snapped. Not in rage, not in panic, but in precision. She could feel her discipline breaking into action, the way a bowstring released sends an arrow flying with unstoppable speed. Her breath slowed, her focus sharpened, and every ounce of her body shifted from calm to combat. "Let go," she said once more. Though now the words were not a warning, they were a verdict. The officer did not release her. His grip tightened, his smirk deepened, his partner stepped closer. In their arrogance, they did not yet realize that the ground beneath them was about to shatter. The tension that had been building since their first words now coiled into a single moment, balanced on the edge of explosion. Rhonda rose slowly from the bench, not jerking free but standing with a deliberate calm that startled them more than if she had shouted. Her posture was no longer that of a woman resting after a run. It was the posture of a fighter, of a champion, of someone who had weathered storms far greater than these men could ever imagine. The taller officer frowned, his bravado flickering. "Sit back down," he barked, though the authority in his voice wavered against the weight of her steady gaze. The lean officer tugged at her wrist, irritated by her lack of compliance. "Don't think you can," he began, but the sentence died in his throat as her eyes locked with his, unblinking, unyielding. The park around them seemed to hold its breath. The last slivers of daylight melted into night, and the lamplight flickered weakly overhead. In that suspended moment, the world contracted into a circle of three, and inside that circle the balance of power shifted, though the two men were too blind to see it yet. Rhonda inhaled once, her lungs filling with air that steadied her. The storm she had promised them was no longer a question of if, but when. And the when was now. The world seemed to constrict around them, every sound muffled, every motion slowed, until the only thing that mattered was the silent battle unfolding between her stillness and their arrogance. Rhonda stood tall now, no longer a woman casually seated on a park bench, no longer a runner catching her breath after a long evening loop around the winding trails. She had risen into the shape of who she truly was beneath the quiet exterior. A fighter, a warrior forged in years of discipline and tempered in countless arenas. Yet she stood without fists raised, without aggression dripping from her posture. Her weapon was not rage but control, not the promise of violence, but the certainty of it should they cross the line again. The taller officer flinched slightly when she moved, not because her motion was violent, but because it carried with it a gravity he had not expected. He masked it with a scowl, his lips peeling back into a sneer as he stepped forward, emboldened by the uniform that clung to him like a shield. The leaner one still had her wrist, though the strength of his grip now felt laughable against the coiled potential in her arm. She looked down at his hand, then back into his eyes, and he saw in that look not fear, not resistance, but a steady coldness that unsettled him in ways he could not admit. "Let go," she said again, her voice low, calm, but ringing with a steel edge that cut deeper than any shout. Instead of obeying, he laughed nervously, trying to mask his unease with bravado. "What are you going to do if I don't?" His fingers tightened, a defiance born of pride rather than strength. Her eyes narrowed. For a moment she considered giving him one last chance, but she knew such chances were wasted here. They had already chosen the path of escalation, mistaking her patience for weakness, her silence for surrender. The taller officer moved closer, his chest puffed, his hand hovering near his belt as if the mere gesture gave him dominance. "You're outnumbered," he muttered, his grin more forced now, less certain than before. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The smirk on his partner's lips echoed the sentiment, but Rhonda could see the cracks forming. They had built their confidence on the assumption that she was ordinary, defenseless, a woman intimidated by a uniform. They did not realize that the uniform meant nothing to her, not when it was worn without honor. She drew in a breath, slow and deliberate, and the sound of it seemed to hush even the insects in the grass. Her shoulders squared, her stance rooted. She looked from one man to the other, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of an oath. "This is your last warning. Step back. Now." The taller officer burst out laughing, his voice too loud, too desperate, as though he needed the noise to drown the fear that whispered at the edges of his mind. "Last warning?" he mocked, gesturing toward her with a derisive sweep of his hand. "What are you going to do, sweetheart? Call someone? Cry? You don't scare us." But she was not trying to scare them. Fear was for those who needed to manipulate. What she gave them instead was truth. The lean officer tugged on her wrist as if to pull her closer, his grip testing the patience she had already stretched beyond reason. His partner moved in, his body towering over her like a shadow that intended to smother. Rhonda tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving theirs. "Then you've made your choice," she said softly. It was the calmness that struck them, the certainty in her voice that stripped their arrogance bare. For the first time, the lean officer's smirk faltered, confusion flickering in his gaze. He yanked at her wrist, trying to reassert his dominance, but the moment he did, the shift happened. She twisted, a movement so fluid it seemed like water flowing over stone, her body pivoting with a grace honed by years of judo and combat training. In less than a breath, the hand that had claimed her wrist was bent backward, his body forced down as his balance crumbled beneath her. His knees buckled, his face contorted in pain as she locked his arm in a position he could not escape. The taller officer swore and lunged forward, his instincts finally catching up to the reality before him, but she was ready. Her body moved in harmony with itself, precise and measured. She stepped aside, his momentum carrying him past where she had stood, and with a flick of her hip she redirected his bulk, sending him staggering. He caught himself on the edge of the bench, his confidence cracking as he realized she was not the woman he thought she was. The leaner officer gasped, struggling against her hold, but she tightened the pressure, forcing him down to the ground, his face pressed close to the dirt and gravel. Her expression remained composed, not cruel, not vindictive, but resolute. She had warned them again and again, and now she was simply following through. The taller one regained his footing, fury twisting his features. He rushed at her again, shouting something incoherent, but his words were drowned by the sharp snap of her movement. She released the man on the ground, pivoted, and caught the second by the arm as he swung. Her grip was iron, her body turning smoothly as she redirected his force, flipping him over her shoulder with a motion so clean it looked effortless. He hit the earth with a grunt, the wind driven from his chest. For a moment, the park was filled with the sounds of struggle, heavy breathing, the scrape of shoes against gravel, the groans of men who had thought themselves predators. But soon even those sounds quieted. Both officers lay on the ground now, one clutching his shoulder, the other cradling his twisted wrist, their eyes wide not only with pain, but with dawning realization. Rhonda stood between them, her chest rising and falling steadily, her hair catching the glow of the lamplight. She was no longer simply the runner they had cornered, nor the woman they had mocked. She was herself in full, strong, disciplined, unbroken. She looked down at them, her expression unreadable, but her voice clear as crystal. "I told you to back off. You chose not to listen. Now stay down." "Our nigger." The taller officer groaned, trying to push himself up, but the glare she leveled at him froze him mid-motion. There was no rage in her eyes, no unhinged fury, only certainty, only control. That was what terrified him most. Rage he could have dismissed, could have laughed off, but this composure, this dominance born of skill, stripped him of any illusion that he had ever been in control. A silence settled, broken only by their labored breaths. Somewhere in the distance, a voice called faintly, someone on another path, but the three of them remained locked in this small circle of reckoning. The officers had pushed and she had answered, not with desperation, not with fear, but with a precision that revealed the truth of who she was and what she could do. She stepped back slightly, her posture relaxed again, though her muscles remained coiled. Ready. She had given them their final warning, and she had carried it out. The storm had broken, but it was not chaos that followed. It was order restored, however briefly, however precariously. They lay before her, defeated not by brutality, but by their own arrogance, undone by the simple refusal of one woman to surrender her dignity. She glanced once more between them, then turned her gaze to the path ahead. The night stretched long, the lamplight flickered, and the world beyond the park waited. But here, in this circle of confrontation, the message was clear. She would not be broken, not by men in uniform, not by the weight of their entitlement. The taller officer wheezed, finally finding his voice, though it was weaker now, stripped of confidence. You're going to regret this," he muttered, though his words lacked conviction. Rhonda only shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "The only regret here is yours." The words hung heavy in the air, a promise, a truth. And as she stepped back, letting the cool night settle around her once again, the silence spoke louder than any threat. The calm had been shattered, the storm had passed, but she remained unwavering, unshaken, ready for whatever came next. The silence that followed her words pressed down on the park like a heavy curtain. The two men lay sprawled at her feet, their bodies writhing with the dull ache of sudden defeat. Rhonda's chest rose and fell steadily, her breath controlled, her posture balanced, every muscle tuned to the possibility of another strike. She stood above them not as a victor gloating over the fallen, but as a sentinel, calm and precise, the embodiment of control. Her eyes flickered between them, watching for the smallest twitch of aggression, ready to move again if necessary. She had no interest in humiliating them further. They had chosen arrogance. They had ignored every warning, and she had responded with what was necessary, nothing more. The taller officer groaned as he rolled onto his side, his face red with rage rather than shame. He planted his palm against the ground and tried to force himself up. His breath came ragged, his pride wounded far more deeply than his body, and his eyes burned with disbelief that a woman he had so casually mocked could so effortlessly put him in the dirt. The humiliation was unbearable, and in his anger he forgot caution. He lunged forward, his arms swinging in a clumsy attempt to grab her leg. But Rhonda shifted before his hand even brushed the fabric of her running pants. A swift pivot of her hips, a subtle turn of her shoulders, and she caught his wrist in a lock so fluid it seemed inevitable. His cry of pain echoed off the trees as she tightened the hold, forcing him back to the ground. Her knee pressed lightly against his shoulder, enough to keep him pinned, but not enough to break him. Her voice remained calm, almost cold, as she leaned close enough for him to hear her clearly. "Stay down," she said, her tone stripped of emotion, filled only with certainty. "Don't make me hurt you more than I already have." The leaner officer had struggled to his knees by now, clutching his ribs, his face twisted with a mixture of pain and fury. He spat into the dirt and forced himself to his feet, swaying slightly. His pride screamed louder than his common sense. Ignoring the sight of his partner immobilized beneath her, he staggered toward her from behind, his arms wide, his hands curled into fists. He came at her with the clumsy determination of a man who refused to believe he was beaten. Rhonda did not even glance back. She felt the shift of air as he moved, the tremor of the ground beneath his boots, the reckless intention in his steps. With a single motion, she released the taller officer and pivoted toward the other, her body flowing like water, guided not by anger but by instinct honed to perfection. As he reached for her, she dropped her weight and caught his arm, her hips snapping into position. In one smooth arc, his body lifted from the ground and slammed onto his back with a force that drove the air from his lungs in a hollow gasp. He writhed in the dirt, clutching his chest as he fought for breath. She stepped back, giving him space, her eyes unwavering, her breathing still steady. She had not struck him. She had not battered him. She had simply redirected his force into his own undoing, the essence of her art, the philosophy she carried within her body and her spirit. Strength was not about brutality. It was about control, about knowing exactly how much power to use and when to stop. The taller officer, still groaning, tried again to rise, his fury undimmed, his pride refusing to accept the reality before him. He staggered to his knees, his eyes filled with venom. But the moment he looked up at her, something in her gaze made him falter. She did not need to shout, did not need to threaten. Her stance, her steady breathing, her unwavering eyes all told him the same truth. Any further attempt would end the same way, or worse. She could feel the tension in the air, the raw energy of their humiliation thrashing against the undeniable truth of their defeat. They had underestimated her, dismissed her warnings, mocked her strength. Now they lay broken, not by violence but by discipline, by the quiet restraint that refused to indulge in cruelty even when cruelty had been shown to her. "Get up if you want," she said evenly, her voice carrying in the stillness of the night. "But you already know how it ends." The lean officer groaned from the ground, still clutching his chest, his breath shallow. The taller one clenched his jaw, his fist trembling at his sides, but he did not move. He wanted to strike, wanted to reclaim the control that had slipped through his fingers, but deep inside he knew that every attempt would only deepen his disgrace. The lamplight flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the path, and for a moment the park seemed utterly deserted, the whole world reduced to this confrontation. Rhonda stood in the center of it, her figure calm, immovable, as though she had always belonged to this moment. The taller officer muttered under his breath, his words too low to catch but filled with venom. He turned his face away, unable to meet her eyes. The leaner one slowly rolled to his side, still gasping, his pride dissolving into a pitiful silence. Rhonda did not move toward them, did not press her advantage. She simply stood, her presence alone more powerful than any strike could have been. Her training had always been about this, not about crushing an opponent, but about commanding space, about dictating the terms of the encounter until no other outcome was possible. And then, from somewhere beyond the trees, voices rose. Distant shouts, hurried footsteps pounding along the gravel path, the sound of other officers responding, the weight of authority drawn by the commotion. Blue lights flickered faintly against the trunks of the trees as a patrol car approached from the road beyond. The two men on the ground stiffened at the sound, their expressions twisting with both relief and fear. Relief that others were coming, fear of what those others might see. Rhonda did not move as the backup drew near. She lowered her hands calmly to her sides, her stance relaxing but still strong, her breathing steady. She had nothing to hide. She had acted with restraint, with discipline, with the dignity they had tried to strip away. The first beam of a flashlight swept across the path, and then voices rang out, sharp and commanding. "What's going on here?" One of the newcomers barked as three more officers rushed into view, their hands hovering near their belts as their eyes took in the scene. The taller officer scrambled to his feet, clutching his wrist, his face twisted with rage. "She attacked us!" he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Rhonda. "We were questioning her, and she went crazy." The leaner one tried to rise as well, still hunched and coughing. "She blindsided us," he rasped, his voice weak. "She's dangerous. Arrest her." The newcomers hesitated, their flashlights darting between the two battered men and the calm woman who stood unflinching in the glow. Rhonda said nothing at first, letting the image speak for itself. Two officers bruised and humiliated, one woman standing steady, her posture balanced and her eyes clear. Then she raised her chin and spoke with quiet authority. "They harassed me. They ignored every warning I gave them. I defended myself. Nothing more." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with disbelief, confusion, and the shifting of loyalty. The newcomers exchanged uncertain glances, their training wrestling with the reality before them. Some had already heard whispers of these two men, of their arrogance, their reckless use of power. Seeing them brought low by the very person they had sought to demean only deepened the cracks in their authority. Rhonda remained calm, her voice steady, her posture unyielding. She had shown them strength, but not through cruelty. She had not unleashed violence, but restraint, not destruction, but precision. It was strength without violence, the purest form of power, the kind that could not be broken because it was rooted not in fury, but in control. And in that moment, under the glow of the lamps and the gaze of witnesses, it became clear that the balance of the night had shifted. The predators were exposed, their arrogance shattered, their humiliation etched into the silence. And she stood, unbroken, a reminder that strength did not require savagery, that true power lay in knowing exactly when to act and exactly when to stop. The beams of flashlights cut through the dimness like searchlights, scattering shadows across the trees and gravel paths. The cluster of approaching officers moved swiftly, boots striking hard against the ground, their voices sharp and commanding, but beneath the formality lay a current of uncertainty. They had arrived expecting to restore order to a scene where they thought a lone civilian had lashed out against two fellow officers. What they found instead was stranger, more complex. Two uniformed men bent in pain and shame on the ground, their breaths ragged and their faces pale, and one woman standing tall, unshaken, the glow of the lamps painting her in calm, resolute light. The taller officer, clutching his wrist, lunged forward to reclaim his authority with words since his body had failed him in strength. He jabbed a trembling finger at Rhonda, his voice rising louder than necessary, trying to fill the silence with a version of events that might rescue his pride. "She attacked us," he shouted hoarsely. "We were questioning her, and she went crazy. Arrest her before she hurts someone else." His words echoed off the trees, loud but hollow, the kind of noise that betrayed desperation. His partner, still hunched from the throw that had left him windless, struggled to find his voice. His breath rattled as he spoke, his words gasping between coughs. "She blindsided us. Out of nowhere. She's dangerous. You need to get her off the streets." His attempt at authority crumbled under the weakness of his body, each word undermined by his obvious defeat. The flashlights swung back to Rhonda, their beams bright in her eyes, but she did not flinch. Her body remained still, her shoulders squared, her arms loose at her sides, her breathing even. She had faced worse stares under hotter lights, entire arenas filled with scrutiny and expectation, and never once had she faltered. She met the officer's gaze without trembling, without retreat. Her voice, when it came, was calm and even, every syllable sharpened with clarity. "They harassed me," she said. "They ignored every warning. I defended myself. Nothing more." Her words were not loud, but they carried weight, slicing through the frantic noise of the accusations with the precision of a blade. For a moment the newcomers stood frozen, torn between loyalty to their colleagues and the evidence before their eyes. They had known the two men to swagger through the precinct, to puff themselves up with authority they wore like armor. Some had heard whispers of misconduct, stories too faint to confirm, but too persistent to dismiss. Now, seeing them broken and furious on the ground, those whispers rang louder in their minds. The taller officer snarled, his pride collapsing into venom. He staggered toward her again, though his movements were shaky, the pain in his arm clear. "Don't listen to her. She's lying. She tried to resist and we had to put her in her place. You all saw what she did to us." But his words faltered as he realized there were eyes not only from the officers around him, but from beyond. A small group of bystanders had gathered at the far edge of the path, drawn by the noise. Some held phones, their screens glowing faintly in the dark. They had recorded everything. Their quiet murmurs floated through the night, sharp with disbelief and indignation. The taller officer's voice shrank against the weight of witnesses, against the truth carried in those tiny devices. One of the newcomers stepped forward, his voice stern. "Enough," he said, his gaze flicking between the two battered officers and the calm woman before him. "We'll sort this out properly." His tone carried less certainty than procedure, but even so, the balance of power was shifting. Rhonda took a slow breath, letting it steady her. She did not smile, did not gloat. She simply stood, her presence as controlled now as it had been when the confrontation began. She had never wanted to fight, never wanted to display her strength in such a place. All she had wanted was a quiet evening in the park, a moment of stillness after a run. Yet the moment had been shattered by arrogance, by entitlement, by the belief that power could excuse cruelty. She had responded the only way she knew, with discipline, with precision, with enough force to end the danger, but no more. The bystanders pressed closer now, emboldened by the arrival of the backup officers. A woman's voice rose above the murmurs. "I saw everything," she said firmly. "They were bothering her." She told them to stop, over and over, and they didn't. She didn't start this, they did. Another chimed in, a man holding up his phone. "I recorded it, all of it. If you need proof, it's right here." The taller officer's face drained of color. The lean one muttered something under his breath, his eyes wide with sudden panic. They exchanged a quick glance, the reality of their unraveling dawning on them at last. Their authority, once unshakable in their own minds, was collapsing under the weight of truth. The senior officer among the newcomers lifted his radio, his voice clipped as he called in for the captain. His words carried the ring of procedure, but beneath them ran an undercurrent of certainty. This would not end with the arrest of the woman standing calm in the lamplight. Rhonda finally lowered her gaze just enough to soften her posture. She had no need to hold her stance any longer. The storm had passed, and though the air was still heavy with tension, the outcome had shifted. Justice, once so fragile, was taking root. Minutes later, another car arrived, and from it stepped a higher-ranking officer, his face grave as he took in the scene. He listened to the stammered accusations of the two humiliated men, then to the steady, unwavering accounts of the bystanders. He reviewed the glowing phone screens thrust into his hands, the undeniable images of what had transpired. His expression hardened, his jaw tight. "Officers Barlow and Grant," he said at last, his voice carrying through the park with finality. "You are suspended immediately pending investigation. Hand over your badges and weapons." The taller one gaped, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. "You can't now," the senior officer snapped, and two of the backup moved in, their faces stony, their loyalty severed by what they had seen. As the disgraced men fumbled with their belts, Rhonda exhaled slowly. The weight that had pressed against her shoulders since the first shadow fell across her bench now eased, not completely, but enough. She had endured, she had held her ground, and now justice was stirring. The hum of voices grew as the bystanders spoke more freely, their relief mingling with outrage. Phones were raised higher, capturing not only the shame of the fallen, but the quiet strength of the woman who had refused to bow. One of the officers approached Rhonda cautiously. "Ma'am," he said, his tone respectful now, stripped of the arrogance that had tainted the evening. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "I'm fine." Her wrist still tingled faintly where the grip had bruised her skin, but her body stood strong, unbroken. What hurt more was not her flesh, but the reminder of how easily power could be abused, how quickly trust in authority could be twisted into a weapon against the innocent. The higher-ranking officer turned to her then, his expression solemn. Thank you for keeping your composure. We will ensure this is investigated fully. Rhonda met his eyes, her voice steady. Make sure it doesn't happen again. Not to me. Not to anyone else. He nodded, the weight of her words pressing into him. The park was alive again now, filled with murmurs, flashing lights, the shuffle of boots, the rustle of leaves stirred by the commotion. Yet amid it all, Rhonda felt a quietness return to her spirit. She glanced at the bench where it had all begun, the place where she had sought nothing more than rest. She walked back to it, sat down once more, and uncapped her bottle of water. The cool liquid slid down her throat as she leaned back, her eyes closing for a brief moment. When she opened them again, the night sky stretched above, dotted with stars beginning to pierce through the haze of the city. The disgrace of two men lay behind her. The murmur of witnesses lingered around her, but in her heart there was only calm. She had not wanted this fight, but she had met it, and she had done so without losing herself to anger. She had shown them strength, and in doing so, she had proven once more that justice could prevail when truth was unflinching. She rose at last, slipping the bottle back into her pouch, her steps steady as she moved toward the exit of the park. Behind her, officers still bustled, voices still rang out, the night still trembled with the aftermath of conflict. But she carried none of it with her. She walked into the darkness beyond the lamplight with the sure stride of someone who had faced arrogance and stripped it bare. Someone who understood that true power was not in the fist, but in the restraint of it. And as she disappeared into the night, the words she had spoken hung in the silence, a promise not only to herself, but to everyone who had watched. Justice was not a gift to be granted by the powerful, but a truth to be claimed by the unyielding. If this story shocked you, don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what happens next. Want more unbelievable twists of justice and power? Watch the next video on your screen and dive deeper into the stories they don't want you to know. And don't keep this to yourself. Share this video with your friends and let everyone see the truth unfold.